Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this second webinar on compensation of innocent victims of armed conflict. My name is Colin McInnes, and I'm the Research Network Lead for the Academi Heddwch, which is hosting this webinar. And before I say anything else, I'd like once more to thank Steve Hollingworth, who's put these two webinars together and assembled a fantastic range of speakers. And at some point, I hope Steve will explain where we hope to go with this, because as an academic, it's really important, I think, to share understandings and to debate and discuss and exchange knowledges. But also, I think for many of us, it's important to use this knowledge for a positive purpose. And I think Steve, towards the end, may well say something about what we're hoping to do with these webinars and with some of the recommendations we're going to hopefully move towards at the end of this. A word first about the Academi Heddwch, which is hosting this. The Academi is a relatively new body, supported by the Welsh Government, but independent of the Welsh Government, and we do thank the Welsh Government for its funding in this. It does basically three things. Firstly, it does education. It lobbies for incorporating peace into curricula, both at schools, in further education, higher education, and as part of lifelong learning, which certainly in Wales is an important part of our life as a nation. Secondly, what we do is we protect and promote Wales's cultural heritage in peace. And this goes back centuries, arguably, but certainly over the last 100 or so years, Wales has been a pioneer in a number of areas in terms of peace building. And most importantly, for our purposes at the Academi Heddwch, in terms of one of our major programmes, is the Welsh Women's Peace Petition, which, if you haven't come across it yet, I do recommend you look it up on the web. And it's a remarkable early instance of civic action to promote peace, where I don't know quite how many or what percentage of Welsh women, but it was a stunningly high percentage of women in Wales wrote to the women of North America, the United States in particular, from half to half, from home to home, I think were the terms used, to try and encourage them to pressurize the US government in peace building and engaging particularly with League of Nations. And the third thing which we do is research, and that's what tonight is about. It's about using research done in universities and elsewhere to try and promote peace and promote greater understanding of how we might achieve a more peaceful world. And I think when it comes to issues which are confronting us today, one of those which certainly I think is right near the top of the agenda is those innocent civilians who are caught up in conflict. Certainly in the UK, we see this on a daily basis, mainly Gaza, but also elsewhere. Ukraine is a popular one, but occasionally Syria, occasionally Myanmar, occasionally South Sudan. So we've become very aware of the manner in which innocent civilians have been caught up in these terrible conflicts, and their lives have been shattered as a result of them. And how we rebuild them and how we incorporate that into development programs is, I think, a crucial aspect of the work which I hope the Academi Heddwch will undertake in the coming months. So that's all I have to say. So I'm going to just hand over now to Steve, who's going to run the rest of the evening. And once again, thank you, Steve, very much indeed.
Colin, diolch yn fawr iawn diolch yn fawr i'r Academi Heddwch Cymru. Croeso pawb. Welcome, everybody. A big thank you to the Peace Academy of Wales. And yes, indeed, Colin, I believe there's a shared value with the work that the Peace Academy of Wales is doing. This work essentially is very important from a research academic point of view, but my hope is that our discussions here and the interest that not only the speakers and the participants and the listeners have in this topic basically can be turned somehow into an active, proactive advocacy effort impacting the opportunities, the needs that civilians have who are caught in conflict. As you mentioned, we're seeing every day on the news what devastation there is and the tremendous loss and suffering from death, the deprivation of basic needs for innocent civilians, in my own experience, having worked in conflict areas, the rights and needs of civilians are the biggest casualty in a conflict. And this past year saw really the largest number of casualties from war since the Rwanda days. And you mentioned, many of the countries that have been, impacted. And some victim compensation efforts work well, and we're very fortunate to have two participants today, who will be speaking about work that they've done. But many of the compensation efforts are hampered by very ad hoc method, lots of political difficulties, flawed designs in many cases, and many times the losses that are suffered by innocent civilians are simply ignored, or they're delegated to another country or to an international agency, and they're very, very insufficient. In my view, a very big issue is that when you compare the overall cost of conflict to the resources invested for humanitarian responses and to rebuild those broken societies, invariably the rebuilding and the humanitarian efforts are really a small proportion of the total expenditure. So we seem to continue to finance war and violence and not build conditions for peace. I was very grateful last week. We were all very grateful to hear from Dr. Elizabeth Salmon, who's at the Pontifical Catholic University in Peru. And we heard from her colleague, Juan-Pablo Perez-Leon-Acevedo. I believe Juan-Pablo's with us today. And essentially, they both outlined how in international humanitarian law and international human rights law, a culture of impunity, right, is in some ways optimistically looking, transitioning towards a greater respect towards the rule of law. This transition is gradual. It's beginning to recognize the rights of victims in serious violations. It's beginning to emphasize to states and to non-state actors the role and obligation they have. National programs are doing this in many ways. Regional courts, the Latin American courts, for example, the European Court of Human Rights, are beginning to show good examples about how to do this. At the core is how innocent civilians caught in the middle of conflict change from being objects to being subjects with rights and having ways of pursuing those rights. Juan-Pablo, in particular, emphasized, what's happening with holding non-state actors accountable in Latin America and Southeast Asia. He also highlighted the complications with dual status individuals like child soldiers. The third speaker was Dr. Mohammed Abu Nimer, who's based at the American University here in Washington, D.C. And of course, Mohammed raised the issue about enforcement of those rights. What are mechanisms for them to be enforced? He also went on to highlight, because his expertise is peace and reconciliation, that reparations are needed. They're important to have legal accountability for it, but also there are moral and ethical and political considerations that need to be brought into the thinking on resolving intractable conflicts. He spoke in particular about conflicts in the Republic of South Africa, in Gaza, in Australia, in the USA, highlighting in particular where political actions and political decisions can be determinant on shifting the whole debate and discussion about building sustainable peace. He highlighted in particular when these intractable conflicts, it's necessary to understand the root causes of conflicts, the structural, the cultural dimensions of violence, the dehumanization of enemies, the victimhood narrative that exists on both sides, and how vital it is to create a conflict transformation pathway that develops new relationships around justice, security, agency, and voice and representation. And he felt in particular in the area of reparations that they can play a very important role when they're not just imposed from the outside, when they're understood, when they're based on the needs, the rights of the impacted communities, but that they can be an important contributing factor in this conflict transformation pathway. I'm very grateful now, to turn, if I can, to the topic for today's conversation, which essentially is about, understanding the experience to date of efforts within nation states between nation states and innocent civilians, and from multilateral institutions, looking at efforts that directly impact individuals, enterprises, other entities that are impacted by conflict. And I'm very grateful to have two amazing presenters today. The first presenter who will address us is Professor Luke Moffett. Luke is a professor at the George Mitchell Institute of Global Peace, Security, and Justice at Queen's University, Belfast. And he's an expert on reparations, on human rights law, international humanitarian law, and transitional justice. His research has been in particular in the role that reparations can play in addressing past violations, the role of law in adjusting to arm, in adjudicating on armed conflict, and construction of victims' rights in domestic and international processes. He's written widely. His book, Justice for Victims Before the International Criminal Court, was published in 2014. There's a recent monograph, Reparations and War, which consolidates his work on reparations and armed conflict for the past decade. We will be making available, if folks will reach out for any bibliography, and we have a number of references that we'd like to share with people. We do have a Q&A, and we welcome any Q&A to be logged in that. But without further delay, I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Luke Moffett. Luke, thank you very much. I know you just got off a plane, so I hope you're okay.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to the Academy for having me. I will maybe share my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. So today I'm going to talk about a couple of issues, probably build on what Juan-Pablo has already talked about last week, and look at where the sort of the rules lie and practice lies at the moment. We, in our project on reparations, it's available here, reparations, qb.ac.uk, has over 500 data points on reparations that have been used around the world. So it's a useful free resource if you want to look up like applications, Truth Commission reports. It's a handy resource, and it's free and open so people can use it in order to do more research on reparations. We did a number of field sites research for the past 10 years, about a dozen countries. I'm just back from Iraq a couple of weeks ago. And in a lot of these countries, we were looking at both how countries had developed reparations during and after conflict, and the sort of the difficulties that are there for victims to sort of get redress. The former UN Special Rapporteur on Truth, Justice, Reparations, and non-guarantees non-recurrence, Pablo de Graaf, points out that there's a massive gap in terms of implementation. That we recognise now in international law and human rights law that there's a right to redress, but it often falls short in terms of enforcement. And so people will talk about the sort of the gap that is in human rights law that also bleeds very much into international humanitarian law. When we talk about rights, we can talk ends, but when it comes to enforcing those rights through remedies, so where their rights are violated, ensuring that victims have reparations that include compensation, it often falls quite short. And so it's almost like Don Quixote in that it's an idealistic view of the world. I think when it comes to the right to reparations, there's continues to be debate on the extent to which this is true. In human rights law, it's very strongly been iterated that there's a right for gross violations of human rights to victims. This is not the case when it comes to international humanitarian law. Rule 150 that the Red Cross has in its customary database suggests that there is a right to reparations for those who suffer violations, and the and basic principles that were passed in 2005 include sort of serious violations of international humanitarian law as given a right to reparations, but in law and practice this doesn't exist. And so I would I'll point out some of the gaps that are there, both in terms of the practice and the law. The bit that sort of bridges these two is international criminal law, such as the International Criminal Court, whereas increasing recognition that individuals who suffer from war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, aggression, do have a right, to some extent, to redress. But as we've seen of many cases at the ICC, it's only the tip of the iceberg. It's a fraction of victims that will get any sort of reparations or compensation. So, for instance, in the recent Ogwen case, a former child soldier who was convicted for over 60 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity in northern Uganda, there's about 50,000 victims who are potentially going to benefit from €750 each, but there's no funding to actually implement that. And the organisation that Ogwen was part of, the Lord's Resistance Army, caused violence to hundreds of thousands of people. And the Ugandan government, which isn't being held to account, also caused massive harms to people. And so reparations, it can sometimes be quite limited. And this is particularly true when we talk about compensation during war. That states, to some extent, don't do reparations or compensation during conflict because they're concerned about giving money to the enemy, that even if civilians are harmed, it may enrich or land groups. Some states are increasingly trying to bring in processes, such as the US and Dutch governments, to sort of mitigate civilian harm. And the US has got quite a detailed civilian harm mitigation and response plan, which includes giving compensation in some form to those who've been harmed. Now, this is a policy that's been going on for a number of years, and it comes from practice that traces back even from the Second World War, the Korean War, where people are given money. I'll talk about condolence payments in a little bit, but there's a moral basis to this that is about recognizing not necessarily that there's been a legal wrong, but that the military actor is responsible for the harm that's caused to civilians. Now, this is very problematic because it moves very much away from what human rights law indicates, in that everybody has the right to a remedy, whereas this sort of condolence payments or this compensation during war is very discretionary. Victims have no rights. And so when it comes to civilians who are harmed and killed in conflict, the vast majority will not get any sort of compensation or redress. And talking to some victims in places like Yemen, where their family members were killed by a US drone strike or by Saudi bombers, they received some compensation, a few $100s for their family member being killed, but they also had to sign a document which waived away their rights from any future claims, and didn't recognize the responsibility of the armed actors who caused this harm. In other countries like the UK, there has been some administrative processes where in former colonies or in areas of conflict that they have been involved in, they have created an administrative scheme. In my own country in Northern Ireland, the British government used this as a way to sort of avoid civilians taking the army to court, in particular the European Court of Human Rights. Yet 50 years on, there's still an ongoing case, the Ireland v UK case, which is bringing up these issues again. The UK government, unlike the US and Dutch, doesn't have or isn't yet developing a civilian harm and mitigation response plan. And so there's been a number of NGOs like AOAV, Ceasefire, and others that have been calling on the UK government to develop a reparations plan to civilians it kills during conflict. And this isn't to say that the UK government should pay out to everybody who's harmed in conflict, but where individuals are being killed, there needs to be some sort of process to recognise harm that's caused, because otherwise it creates this culture of impunity where civilians are killed en masse, and we see that in Gaza, and there's then this qualifier that these people are human shields, and so they lose their civilian protection. Civilians are civilians protected under the Geneva Conventions. They only lose their protection when they're directly participating in hostilities. We don't need to use the word innocent to describe civilians. Civilians are necessarily innocent under the law, under the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law, whatever you want to call them. And so when they're killed, governments and militaries can articulate that this is lawful under the Geneva Conventions on the basis that they have discretion when it comes to the use of force. But we see in Gaza, we see in Sudan and elsewhere that civilians bear the brunt of violence because of the urban environments in which wars now occur. The UK government has engaged with some sort of compensation to some civilians that is killed. And so AOIV has documented there was just over 100 cases where the UK government has given compensation. Now, with Raqqa and Mosul being bombed by the RAF and US allies, the UK government has only recognised one civilian killed. Despite dropping thousands of bombs in an urban environment, it's only recognised that one civilian was killed. And this is sort of detached from reality. Having grown up in a country where 1,000-pound bombs were set off in towns and villages around where we lived, they cause massive amount of damage. And so if you're dropping thousands of those in a tightly packed urban environment, you're killing lots of civilians. It may be lawful under the laws of war, and this gets back to the sort of the gap that there is in international humanitarian law of a lack of a right for civilians to hold those responsible for the harm that they cause. And so while states might want to do compensation because of moral reasons and the way they want to be presented, it's almost like a public relations exercise that, yes, they recognize that civilians are harmed and they'll give them some money. It doesn't equate to reparations or compensation as we understand under international human rights law. And this sort of goes back to the basis of reparations in international law, that reparations really are about wiping out the consequences. And the difficulty with international humanitarian law is that it makes most violence permissible. So it doesn't make collateral damage wrongful. And this is highly problematic in places as we're seeing in Gaza. Even the Russian government has argued that it attacking Ukrainian cities is because Ukrainian armed forces are embedded with the civilian population. So in other words, nobody is protected. All civilians are fair target because they're just being used as human shields. And this really erodes the protection that civilians have more. And so it goes back to the point I made at the start that rights are connected to remedies. And if we don't have effective remedies, then rights get eroded. And when it comes to international humanitarian law, civilians have very little rights. They have no right to compensation. They have no right to reparations. The right rests with the state in an international armed conflict. And those very much reflect very few conflicts that happen at the moment. Ukraine and Russia is probably, the main one today. But the vast majority of conflicts, the ICRC says there's 120 conflicts around the world, are conflicts which happen within a country. And there's very little legal protection for civilians within those rules. And so IHL very much permits a lot of violence against civilians without necessarily ensuring their rights or protection. And even human rights law, very much is interpreted in relation to laws of war, in that when it comes to proportionality, it's the military commanders who decide, and notions of what is excessive very much turns on, what the commander thought would be an advantage. But what we are seeing is this turn to condolence payments and mitigation of civilians harm. And so the US has been doing this for decades. And so there's a picture here of US forces handing out payments to Afghan family members and community leaders for the death or damage done to civilians. And so it's not recognizing that there's a violation that's occurred, but that a civilian has suffered as a result of military action. In different terms, a condolence payment, about making amends. It's not the word reparation isn't used because it's a legal term, and this is quite problematic because again it's about stripping away civilians' rights, and is also used by the military as a way of sort of fighting against the enemy. So it's a counterinsurgency strategy. It's about winning hearts and minds. Yeah, the difficulty is when you're providing money in a hostile environment is that you're going to cause repercussions in the community, and I can speak about this in the Q&A. But we spoke to a number of actors in Colombia and Uganda about this practice, and there was differing views on this and practice. There's no consistent practice this point to of civilians being compensated. often when we talk about reparations, it's years, decades, if ever, if victims get redress. And that's because during conflict, victims can't get together and demand reparations because they're trying to survive the fear repercussions, or they're completely displaced from any sort of working legal system that could enforce their rights. So it's incredibly dangerous and also burdensome for victims to claim reparations. And so this reflects the sort of the weakness of the law, that the law doesn't provide a safety net to ensure civilians' rights. And I'll just conclude here to give more time for Q&A. But I think reparations are very much focused on civilian harm, and are trying to mitigate that. And I'm sure Juan-Pablo and Elizabeth spoke in some more depth about how they actually remedy victims' harm. But international humanitarian law is a gap that doesn't provide a right to civilians for the harm that they've caused. And often it's because they don't have a right to claim for their harm. It has to be based on a violation, which is very limited when we start talking about collateral damage. And so during our project, we developed the Belfast Guidelines as a way of sort of broadening out how reparations could be practiced both during conflict and after conflict. And I think we wanted to include both these aspects of during and after conflict because many conflicts are reoccurring. Many conflicts do not end after a few weeks. They can be for years or decades. And so victims can't wait that long. And so we need to recognize that reparations should be carried out during conflict. And in Ukraine, they're trying to do this through the register of damage and the other domestic registers that they're trying to create. But victims need to get access to compensation, to rehabilitation, and to other measures to sort of remedy their harm, because their harm will become worse over time. And so I think when we're thinking about a gap and where things need to go is how do we create a right to reparation? How do we move away from condolence payments, which are charity, they're discretionary, there's no legal protection, to start looking at how we can learn from redress and reparations and providing a sort of a legal framework and safety net for victims, and particularly civilians who've suffered harm during conflict. So I'll leave it there and I'll probably pick up some of the stuff in the Q&A.
Luke, thank you very much. Bethan, I'm not sure if we have Q&A. I can't see any at the moment. Let's see. No, doesn't seem like it. Luke, I did have a question maybe you can address. In your experiences, and you've worked advising a number of these programs, where have you seen kind of successful ones that have created some kind of, more sustainable peace and reconciliation in the context?
Yeah, people always ask, point to the good example. I think there's no good examples. I think with reparations, it's a struggle. It's always a struggle because those who are responsible for committing violence aren't just one individual. It's groups, it's governments, it's people who believe what they did in the past was right and justified. It's about constantly going back to what reparations are about, and it's about vindicating people's rights, their human dignity, and that they deserve to have a place in society as a citizen. And so when that's eroded, when they're attacked, when they're killed, when they suffer rape or torture, it undermines their protection, their dignity, and their personal integrity. And so if that's not going to be protected over time, then it sort of erodes what reparations are about. So in Iraq, it's got a whole scale of reparations programs for different victims groups, from the Saddam Hussein regime to different massacres that were carried out by ISIS and other groups. And so it's throwing money at the problem doesn't solve it. It requires political leadership to constantly recognize and prevent these violations from going forward. And so each government coming in changes that. So in Colombia, you had a right-wing government, now you've got a left-wing government. You got a lot of money needs to be invested in the reparations program, despite being the biggest in the world. So success is, there's too many variables in order to engineer what it is, but mainly it boils down to, is there sufficient political will to carry forward this peace building reconciliation exercise?
Do you see any counterparts globally, whether it's governments or multilateral organizations or others, who seem to recognize what you're talking about and the need for that? Is there any action anywhere?
Yeah, there is recognition, and there is a lot of organizations that do work towards these goals, like the Council of Europe, the International Organization for Migration, and other like NGOs like Redress, the ICJ. You've been working for decades on these issues and do advocate and bring together and bring technical expertise. Like the IOM was instrumental in the German forced labor compensation scheme, and is also involved in the Yazidi survivor law in Iraq. So it's been, supporting those processes. What I would say is that there's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of like big words that people use all the time. So I was at a conference on Ukraine a few months ago, and people were saying, the same things were saying 2 years ago. It needs to be victim centered. Russia needs to pay. We need to use assets, and we need to build a program that's victim sensitive, trauma informed. But these are just words, and in terms of having an effective process, you need to have some sort of sufficient design, political will, and the big thing is money. It's compensation is easy for a lot of states because they can spend the money. It's very difficult to then put in services for rehabilitation or to create memorials, or for the government to issue a public apology. Like when it comes to Israel, there's 2 reparations registers from one from 1948 and one from the advisory opinion on the wall that still haven't been implemented. And so you got generations now waiting on implementation. So states and other armed actors are often reluctant to implement these things. So it's easy to say everybody should get reparations, everybody should get redress. It's a real political struggle. It's a social one. It's a moral one. Places like Guatemala and Nepal, victims are out marching on the street year in, year out in order to get just a basic funding of programs that they need. So it's a very difficult course. That's because those who commit violence are still remain in power or still have the influence to derail victims' claims.
Thank you so much, Luke. I'm going to turn now, if I can, to Dr. Mojtaba Kazazi. I was very impressed in my reading with the work that he did in leading as the executive head of the United Nations Compensation Commission, really that was set up under the Security Council of the United Nations to provide reparations into Kuwait after the Iraqi invasion into Kuwait. And it is cited as being one of the most comprehensive, largest compensation programs, reparations programs that I think the world has seen. Dr. Kazazi is a former judge in the courts of Tehran, and he has long experience in international arbitration. He served as a vice president of the Institut de Droit International, and has acted as an arbitrator in many different disputes, including a number in Bangladesh, which I have a direct interest in, having served in Bangladesh myself. Dr. Kazazi has worked extensively in arbitrations and settlement of claims before the Iran-United States Claims Tribunal in The Hague. I mentioned his work at the UNCC, and it's really my honor to have Dr. Kazazi with us to present his experience in general, but in specific too about the work that the United Nations Compensation Commission did. So, Dr. Kazazi, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you also for this initiative and the help you are going to provide to the people in need. I will be very happy to provide a brief introduction to the work of the UN Compensation Commission, which was set up after the illegal invasion and occupation of Kuwait by Iraq in 1990. The invasion was in 1990, August 1990, by the Security Council. Before doing that, let me just mention that you introduced me as the director of the UNCC, executive head of the UNCC. I must say that I wasn't the executive head for the whole period. I was towards the last period, but there were others before me who were the executive head, and I was working there. Of course, I was from the beginning a member of the senior team and working there. But the main point is that what I'm going to explain and what UNCC has done is a collective work by many, many people in the UNCC and outside, that all together they have achieved this work. Let me start by talking about the how the commission was constituted, how it was formally created. It was created, to summarize it, it was created by the Security Council resolutions 687 and 692, both of them in 1991. Now, resolution 687 is a very long, detailed, and comprehensive resolution passed by the Security Council. Probably it's the longest still. And it is the most important one concerning the situation between Iraq and Kuwait. It doesn't deal only with the question of compensation. There were many other issues, and some of the issues that other speakers today and last session mentioned were covered there. For instance, question of demarcation of boundary, and a boundary commission was created. Question of demilitarized zone, UNICOM, destruction of weapons that led to UNSCOM and UN MOVIC, return of Kuwaiti property seized by Iraq, and etc. There are many, some aspects of the trade embargo that had already been imposed by the Security Council on Iraq and occupied Kuwait. But probably the most important part, and in any event what relates for our today's discussion, is the question of compensation, which was addressed in paragraph 16 of that resolution, resolution 687 of 1991. That paragraph simply mentions that Iraq is responsible Iraq is liable under international law for any direct loss, damage, including the environment loss, or injury to foreign governments, nationals, and corporations as a result of Iraq's unlawful invasion and occupation of Kuwait. I am emphasizing on this because this is very important for the work of the UNCC, but also it's a very good example of probably any future work that could be set up. For the UNCC, it was important because it, in reality, it shortened the time that UNCC had to spend on processing of claims, and increased the speed and clarified the mandate of the UNCC. Legally, what it did, which was very important and addressed some of the issues that Professor Moffett just mentioned on the shortcomings of international humanitarian law, was that the UNCC didn't have to look for a violation of IHL or international human rights law or other international law for accepting of the claim. The liability of Iraq was established here by the Security Council, and of course, in the same resolution, Security Council requested that Iraq will accept the whole resolution as a condition for the ceasefire, which Iraq did. But the issue was, in fact, in UNCC whether a loss is direct or not, which was a sometimes complicated issue by itself, but because there were from time to time some exaggerated claims as well. But the commissioners who decided on claims, this was a question for them. whether this loss is directly and without interruption of other intervening events resulting from the invasion of Kuwait or not. And UNCC, I can say, generally was generous in its interpretation of this provision when it concerned individuals and humanitarian cases, but it was more strict when it came to the government, to the corporations and government claims, which were huge claims and large claims and big claims. This Article 16, which I won't go through it more, it also defined very carefully the jurisdiction of the UNCC. For instance, it excluded debts and obligations of Iraq arising prior to 2nd August 1990, which was very important. Otherwise, UNCC would have become a place for all the claims against Iraq. After this resolution, the Security Council asked the Secretary General of the United Nations, who serves as the Secretary of the Security Council, to prepare a report on how the Commission should be set up. And of course, in Resolution 687, it was also decided that the fund should be set up. So that was also referred to the Secretary General for his views at the time. The Secretary General prepared his reports. The number is S/22559. This is a public document available on the internet. The report, this is an important report, obviously. It had two main sections: international framework and the question of implementation of the decision or the organization. On the institutional framework, the Secretary General recommended that UNCC should operate under the United Nations financial rules and regulation and as a subsidiary organ of the Security Council, which it did, and it helped a lot that the UNCC had the authority of the Security Council behind it. On the structure of the Commission, the Secretary General proposed three organs: a governing council, commissioners, and secretariat. Now, briefly, if I can mention the task of these three organs. The governing council was the policy-making organ of the Commission. It was composed of the Security Council member. As I just mentioned, UNCC was a subsidiary organ of the Security Council, so it made sense that the board should be composed of the Security Council at any given time, meaning the 5 permanent members plus the 10 non-permanent members who were there, commissioners who decided on claims, and the secretariat that provided services to both the governing council and the commissioners. So in fact, the bulk of the work was on the secretariat to process the claim, to prepare them, to prepare decisions for the governing council and discussions. The functions of the governing council was, of course, the most important. I mentioned the titles of this, the heads of this decision, guidelines for claims processing. At the beginning, even before issuing the claim forms, the governing council had to clarify with the help of the secretariat what are the main problems, issues that should be avoided, and the questions that could be answered to avoid problems later. For instance, one of the decisions the governing council made that the military personnel could not file a claim, which was very good, or had guidelines about corporate claims, about business claims, and of course decided on the fixed amounts for the claims, the small claims of the individuals, which were very helpful. And also, very importantly, the governing council approved the rules of procedure that the Secretariat prepared and they approved. Another head of for the decisions of the Governing Council is the appointment of the commissioners. There were 17 or 18 panels of commissioners, and they were approved by the Governing Council, proposed by the Secretariat, approved by that. They also approved the compensation awards. As a lawyer, this was a bit difficult at the beginning for me, but then I realized that this is a sort of a political organizations under the Security Council, and that makes sense that they should be the one to approve awards. And later I saw that not only it helps, but the Governing Council never interfered, or any of the members of the Governing Council interfered in any of the awards, and all the decisions that were made by the commissioners and presented to the Governing Council, they were approved without any change and and they were all approved by consensus. In fact, it is amazing that all about 300 Governing Council decisions, and some of them are very, very important, they were all made by consensus. I should mention also in bracket that this also means why the task of the Secretariat was difficult, because to prepare the Council members, to explain well to them in advance the issues, the problems, the need, and all that, to address specific issues that some of the main members could have had on one specific group of claims and all that, in order to make it possible for them to join the consensus. And as a result, it's a record that all the decisions of the Governing Council were made by consensus all the way to the end. The Governing Council also decided on the priority and mechanism for payment of compensation awards. This was a very important, these were important decisions. The Governing Council basically provided priority in two groups of claims. Claims, small claims of individual, we can say humanitarian cases, because these were claims for fixed amount of $2,500. And the other group were the environmental claims. They were huge, they were large, but because at the time, I mean, in the early 90s, this was an innovation that had been mentioned in the Security Council decision. So it was a good decision from the Governing Council to provide priority to them as well. The priority that was provided to these two groups, to the fixed claims of individuals and to the environment, was first at the processing of the claims, and then later were at the payment of claims. So in both parts, both occasions, they got priority. They were processed first, and they were paid first at the time that the UNCC used to receive lots of money, but still there was not enough money at each given time to pay all the awards, so they got priority. And finally, the Governing Council was the organ that approved the budget of the UNCC, administrative budget, the cost of running the program. This was very important because this exempted, after some issues and some discussions in the first year, this exempted the UNCC from going to the committee of the General Assembly, ACABQ, which is a very important committee, but very busy, and it will take time. I mean, all the organizations go there and they have to fight for their budget. But because the argument was that UNCC is a sort of an extra budgetary organization, the budget is not coming from the budget of the United Nations, but from the funds that UNCC is receiving. So then it was natural that it was approved by the Governing Council. Now, let me mention how the UNCC grouped the claims. This gives an idea of the work that was done. the claims were divided to 6 groups of claims. 4 groups for individuals, so the emphasis was on individuals, 1 group for corporations, and 1 group for governments and international organizations. This was another innovation in UNCC and in UNCC rules of procedure, that international organizations were able to file claims, international organizations of public international law. In fact, I should also mention that UNCC made sure that everyone could file a claim. For instance, stateless persons, immigrants who didn't still have a nationality of the country that they were, or for other reasons. UNCC appointed some individuals and some organizations who could receive those type of claims and filed. The 4 category of individual claims were, the first category, category A, were for departure from Iraq or Kuwait. Anyone who departed as a result of the invasion was entitled to $2,500 at the time. That was the idea of a quick compensation. When we talk about the fixed claims, and these were large claims, for instance, category A claims, there were 923,000 claims. So they were used with the help of mass claims processing techniques, with the help of computers at the time, which was an innovation by itself, this type of programs in the 90s. But it was enough for these individuals to show up in the database that the UNCC had put together with the help of Iraq and Kuwait and others, and flight manifests from Iraq and Kuwait, and the residents, foreign residents at the time of the invasion, Iraq and Kuwait. If they would show up there, that was enough. They didn't have to provide proof for the amount of claims. It was the same for the next category, which was category B, for individual claims for serious personal injury or death. Here also there was a fixed amount of 2,500 to 10,000 for these individual. The claims here, fortunately, were smaller. There were about 6,000 claims. They were processed in 3 installments. And in fact, this was the first group of claims that was paid by UNCC to prove that it is real, that it had money, and it means it, that this is a compensation and it will be paid. Then it was category C claim, also for the individuals, but in this category, the ceiling was $100,000. And of course here, people would have to provide proof. It could be the same ones who had received already 2,500 under B, or more under A, or under B, but here they could ask for more, but provide proof for their damage, for their losses. But this was also a large category with about 500,000 claims. Category D claims, which was the last group of claims by the individual, was for claims above $100,000. So the burden of proof was a bit more strict in that one, because these were large. Some of them were for millions of dollars of claims, and of course they would have to provide proof for their losses, that their claims are arising directly from the invasion of Kuwait. Then category E claims were claims of corporation. There were about 7,000 claims in these, and they were claiming 78 billion. I passed these parts quickly because I see that the HERE initiative is more concentrating on the individuals, and then there were government claims and individual and environmental claims in category F. There were, in addition to this, there were a group of later, a category was created specifically for the Palestinians as the late filed claims, because their claims had not been presented, and there were over 46,000 claims that were presented by the Palestinians who were living in the occupied territory. Also, there were another group of claims called Bedouin claims. Bedouin means without, and these are people living in Kuwait, and it means Bedouin Jinsiyya, without nationality. Some of them have been living in Kuwait for many years, and 2-3 generations, but they are recognized as Bedouin. They work, they live there, they work, they benefit from many of the government services that they are receiving, but now it's much better. Here we are talking about 1990. Their claims had not been filed by Kuwait, but at a later time, the government of Kuwait agreed to help them file their claims, and about 20,000 claims were filed by Bedouins. Now, as I mentioned, 17 panels of commissioners assessed the claims with the help of the Secretariat. These panel members were professional experts, including lawyers, accountants, and some insurance loss adjusters for the claim. We learned that that was very helpful to have a loss adjuster on the panel to help, not just to have 3 lawyers. Always the chair was a lawyer because of the procedure and precedents and all that. In total, 2.7 million claims were filed in 6 categories that the UNCC provided claim forms for. Amount claimed were approximately $352 billion for this program. And the total amount awarded was approximately $52.5 billion. The difference between the amount claimed and amount awarded, first of all, is normal, natural in international claims and arbitration. One always thinks that the damage is more, loss is more. Sometimes it's a tactic to try to get at least what they have lost. But here, the important thing is that the ratio, I'm not going to go through details of it, but the ratio of acceptance of claim was much higher for the individual claims and then less for the corporate and government. So the difference that we see here is more for those 2 groups of claims that were done. And for instance, there were countries that practically lost all their claims because the UNCC decided that they are outside the jurisdiction. So this didn't mean that they were not entitled to this, but they didn't fall within the Article 16, Paragraph 16 of Resolution 687. Now, just a word on payment of claims before I stop. The mandate of the UNCC was to process claims, decide on claims, that's one, and pay the claims. That was very important. Now, these 52.5 million claims, $52.5 billion that were awarded by UNCC, were funded from the oil exports of Iraq. What the Security Council did from the beginning, in Resolution 705 in 1991 and later in 7112, etc., they decided, based on a report that was prepared by the UN Secretariat in New York, that Iraq should pay 30% of its oil revenue for compensation from the beginning. And they thought this was fair. They calculated that 70% would be enough for the humanitarian needs of the Iraqi population, etc. Unfortunately, all these calculations collapsed because of the sanctions that the same United Nations imposed of Iraq. So Iraqi nation didn't have money, and UNCC didn't have money. So it was interesting that UNCC, as a United Nations organ, as a subsidiary organ of the Security Council, we were calling for the sanctions to be removed, to be relieved, and we didn't have money. We were in trouble for the processing of claims. We had to get loan, we had to, but we tried to survive until some solutions were found and oil for food was put into a plan, and then UNCC received money. But eventually money came, and lots of money came, 30% of the revenue of Iraq. And this 30% continued until, I think, 2005, where the Security Council reduced it to 5%. In more recent years, it was even reduced to 1%. But to make the story short, about a year ago, the last payment was made by the UN Compensation Commission, and it was paid to the last cent, which is probably unprecedented in the history of Claims Commission. I was mandated by the Governing Council towards the last years, when there was still $30 billion left, to negotiate and convince them to have a settlement. And Kuwait was willing, but Iraq wasn't. I mean, we had a number of sessions, traveled to Iraq, to Kuwait, meetings in Geneva, etc. But Iraq didn't really put much effort in that process. And somehow I had the impression that they preferred to pay the amount and finish it. And they did pay that to everyone, including the large claims. I think I see that my time is over. I stop there. If there is time at the second section that you have mentioned, maybe I can mention about the features of the UNCC and the key elements on the success of that were important for the success of the UNCC. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kazazi. Thank you. That was fantastic. I just had one brief follow-up. You know, it's often cited that the UNCC had some unique circumstances. It had unanimity in the Security Council. It had, you know, a clear resolution about the liability that Iraq was facing. It had, you know, access to resources to do that. Do you feel the program accomplished, you know, a level of satisfaction with the clients about the compensation that they receive?
Thank you. Yes, UNCC, I mean, the circumstances or this situation was a lucky situation because, as you mentioned, the atmosphere at the Security Council was completely different from now. It was right after the end or so-called end to the Cold War. And Resolution 687 and 692 that I mentioned, I mean, these are very complicated and important, far-reaching resolutions. These were approved without vetoes and easily at the Security Council, and it passed. Now, the same atmosphere was reflected at the Governing Council, whom, as I mentioned, they managed to keep a consensus on all these decisions and go along with them. On whether satisfaction, I would say definitely yes. Yes, yeah. There were some people, some organizations who were not happy because their claim, or even some governments, their claims were rejected or were not accepted. But that was part of the rules. I mean, the jurisdiction was defined. It was there within the jurisdiction. Yes, UNCC was successful because the processing was very fast. Thanks again to the Security Council defining this direct loss and not going each time to being forced to prove the international responsibility of a sovereign state, which is a huge task, which is very, and UNCC was exempted from that. And second, speed in payments, which UNCC had, and full payment. Just one point, it has been very successful. It has been very satisfactory because even those years and even now, when I have been speaking in some place or somewhere and all that, there are always people who ask, what about us? What about this place? I mean, I don't mention name because they are many. I say, I'm sorry, but yes, they didn't even set up anything for you. You were not lucky.
Yeah.
This was specific circumstances that led to this. So it has been something exceptional and something very successful.
Thank you so much.
With lots of experience. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. There is one question in the Q&A. It related to Gaza. In spite of the fact that the Security Council is not as unified as it was, might there be circumstances to create a similar program for Gaza, or might there be another world institution that should be set up to do this? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Do you want me, Steve, to
please?
comment?
Yes, please, Dr. Kazazi.
Okay, thank you. Question of compensation for Palestine has always been on the table since decades ago. Of course, recent sad events and unbelievable destruction and loss of lives and all that has added to that and has brought it to the forefront. There has been lots of meetings, lots of organization. There is a committee, there is a committee in New York from the General Assembly. I have been in some of those meetings. I even, at some point, there was a meeting, I think 2012 in Egypt. I made a presentation about the experience of the UNCC. There were many governments there and all that. Yes, this is something, and this is probably question of compensation is one of the main issues that will facilitate a settlement. Because the question of right of return, and if that cannot be established fully, then at least should be replaced with compensation. You cannot just say, no, that's not possible anymore, and no compensation and all that. So this is very, very, very important. And of course, there is, I think Professor Moffett mentioned it in a different context. There is this register in Vienna for part of the damage, for the wall that few years ago Israel was building. There is a register in Vienna. They are registering the claim. I don't know. I'm not updated what they are doing. But yes, this is important. It will be very huge. It will be probably as huge as UNCC. So far as I know, the main issue, the main problem has been, okay, it's easy to set up a place and go through the claims, but who will pay? Because probably it's beyond the capability of Israel. They should definitely participate, but that issue should be resolved. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I would like now, if I can, to turn towards some of the next session, if we can. Colin, you raised with me, where are we taking this? What are we going to do? And I have to be honest, I don't know, frankly. I think we're all brought together by a real concern, for civilians caught in armed conflict and what needs to be done for them, by them. But one of the things I've learned is best thing to do is to ask the experts. And I'd like to turn now. I put out a request to our presenters, basically help us provide recommendations on how a victim-centered approach on reparations, on compensation can be realized. Help us to consider some realistic actions that civil society, that international organizations, government, research organizations, even civilians in the middle of conflict can undertake. And hopefully out of that set of recommendations, we may gain some insights onto what steps we can take. I am very, very grateful that the Welsh Academy of Peace and the Welsh government is very involved in this, because I believe with all the contacts that I've had for many years in Wales, that there's a very strong moral vein in its DNA that is really critical for this discussion now. So with that, basically, I open the floor up, and I don't know, Dr. Kazazi, Professor Moffett, Juan-Pablo, whoever would like to begin that, I'd be very grateful. Juan-Pablo, thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to all the speakers, which had provided very, very valuable insights about actions. Actions from us as a group of academics and or practitioners who, in different capacities, had published and had worked in the issues of reparations for victims of IHL violations. I consider, Professor Salmon and I consider that there may be the following practical actions. So I am not talking about substantive, procedural, institutional issues, but what we can do, logistically speaking, right? That is the question now. A first possibility is basically, I would say, to focus. I mean, I will mainly focus in my comments about the actions that we can undertake targeting international institutions, international courts. I am quite sure that probably Dr. Kazazi, Professor Moffett can complement or expand on national mechanisms. So with that caveat in mind, concerning the mechanisms that exist at international and regional courts, we consider that one important action is to provide what is called as support for strategic litigation. Strategic litigation which can be impactful in the three regional human rights courts, the Inter-American Court, the European Court, and the African Court of Human Rights. Why is that important? In the three regions, a lot of the national implementation, the national reparations and implementation programs have progressively established a dialogue between, for example, reparation programs in Colombia, Peru, Guatemala, and Salvador, vis-a-vis what the Inter-American Court has decided in cases against those four states. In Europe, we have this series of pilot projects that concerns provision of reparations addressing structural problems that started as a pilot project with some cases in Poland in the early 2000s related to problems of right to property, right to land, that extend actually from the time of the Second World War. And in Africa, there is an emerging reparations jurisprudence concerning, for example, indigenous communities in Kenya. There was a major case decided a couple of years ago, and last year, a major environmental case that affected people in Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, where the African Court already decided a very comprehensive reparations judgment. So those three regions, Latin America, Europe, and Africa, can benefit tremendously from our action, trying to galvanize, try to channel actually these strategic impact litigation efforts. And how can that be implemented? By convening experts. It could be academic institutions, it could be national, international, regional NGOs, preparing amicus curiae, preparing briefs that intend to guide or better guide the judges that take those decisions at the international level. But at the same time, we also, or we will suggest also lobbying at a national level. By lobbying at a national level, we need to establish a network of contacts with local NGOs, activists, and even politicians especially of certain political colors that I need to specify, who tend to be more keen, more open to international law standards, no? And in that sense, when there are debates, which in many cases, in the Global South especially, are very hot-heated, about whether a national budget should be allocated to provide reparations for some factions of groups that participated in conflicts, or even in context of dictatorial regimes, then it's key actually to provide them with some legal or technical or interdisciplinary expertise to push and manage to get those victim-centered legislation, victim-centered acts approved. And also, even at the executive level, once we had those legislations, when those legislations had to be developed via directives, via regulations, it's important also to lobby and to be in contact with local experts, talking in respective languages. I think that also local language and local culture are key. So in that sense, I would say that at least in those three regions in which we have a very intensive multi-layer dialogue between the regional and the national, we can do a lot of lobbying, a lot of strategic litigation impact actions. However, the situation, and I refer to the other excellent panelists, is for us a bit more convoluted about regions, for example, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, where we don't have actually that regional machinery, right? Then the situation is more challenging. And a second possibility is a lot of these developments had led to some fragmentation of approaches at the international level, but again, the international level that has a very intensive dialogue with national actions. For instance, we mentioned 1 week ago that the International Court of Justice delivered its first reparations judgment for mass atrocities. The ICJ ordered Uganda to pay 325 US American dollars, millions. That first installment, 65 millions US dollars, has already been paid by Uganda to the Democratic Republic of Congo. However, there is a pledge by the Congolese government to establish a fund to distribute that amount of money in favor of victims, Congolese victims, and the respective communities. So in that sense, we have there an important development at the ICJ, but also that development has been undertaken on a parallel basis as all these cases that Professor Moffett referred coming from the ICC, including the Luanga case, I mean, in his extensive list of publications, I meant, Lubanga, Katanga, Nataganda, to some extent even on Wen, because all the regional context, all the situation. However, there is no coordination, there is no judicial dialogue. So, for example, one possibility for us as a kind of informal think tank, or for the Welsh Academy piece, would be actually to convene legal experts that work in these different institutions that are addressing the same context of mass atrocities. And this is not only about Africa. This is also now about Ukraine, about Syria, about Gaza, about Georgia, to some extent, Georgia versus Russia before the European Court of Human Rights, although that Georgia versus Russian case failed, unfortunately, at the ACJ. But the point is that, for instance, in the past, Brandeis University, the Brandeis University based in the States, they organized a series of seminars with University of Oslo pluricourts that study the legitimacy of international institutions, where they convene a number of judges and they deliver reports about recommendations on how to enhance the legitimacy of these international institutions. Also, if I remember correctly, for some years, the senior staff members of the Inter-American Court, the European Court, and the African Court of Human Rights met in some kind of retreat. They had that kind of high-level dialogue to, to share experiences and to have those synergies. But I think that after the pandemic, somehow that was a factor that played against. So my point is to try to become a kind of vessel or platform or agora in which NGOs and academics put these experts together, put these decision makers, talk to each other directly to have those synergies. Other than that, I will be happy to follow up on that. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I just wanted to give a time update. We do have 15 minutes extra that we can go on this webinar, I've been informed. So I apologize for running over, but I want to make sure we give time, to Luke, to Professor Moffett, and to Dr. Kazazi. So, Professor Moffett, do you want to go next? You're very. Thank you.
Thanks. I think it may complement Juan-Pablo's point. I think we've got a lot of law at the moment in this area, and more law isn't going to save us. I think one thing that we'll be working on over the next year is trying to get the new UK government and hopefully to adopt a policy on civilian mitigation of harm. So ceasefire, the NGO based in London proposed a couple of years ago that the UK should have a reparations program for its overseas military operations. And I think that's something domestically that can be done. The US government is already pushing the UK government to do this, and NATO is going to have some sort of strategic alignment on this issue. It's got policy already in this area, but it's going to have procedures in place, because it's about managing image and also having a clear, consistent process across the coalition. The Dutch government is already doing it because of bombings like in Chora and Awaja, where high number of civilians were killed. So I think that's something that can be done. In 3 years' time, jet lag still. 3 years' time, it'll be the 50th anniversary of the additional protocols, and I think at that point, we over the next 3 years, the International Committee of the Red Cross and others are going to be looking back and thinking about where we're at. There's calls now for a new Geneva Convention or a 4th additional protocol to deal with contemporary conflict. And I think one of the issues would be the protection of civilians in urban environments from explosive weapons. We've already got the political declaration on that. How do we make that more practical? Would be there has to be consequences. There is likely to be prosecutions at the ICC or arrest warrants issued for the use of explosive weapons in urban environments. Whether that's in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, these issues are all being looked at across the board, but I think that's something which will be looked at. And if that comes up at the ICC, then reparations will be coming down the road. But having a sort of both domestic practice in the UK that sort of correlates to where things are moving at this point, that international law doesn't have the answer, but states are domestically doing that. I think Juan-Pablo has talked about, lawyers and experts should be getting involved in strategically driving that, and I agree. But thinking about broader policy, the UK could lead in this issue. The Welsh government could bring its own perspective and put energy into this, because it's not there at the moment. That globally the UK could be leading on this and saying that it had a strong role in the political declaration in Dublin around explosive weapons over a year ago. And so I think this is the next step about making it real for civilians, that civilians where they're harmed need to be remedied. We can't just leave civilian suffering. So I think that's where we go.
Thank you so much. Very insightful. And Dr. Kazazi? I think you need to unmute, sir. Unmute.
My apologies. Thank you. Your question is very, very important, but also very difficult. I mean, it sounds simple, but it is very difficult because, I mean, the dimensions of the current tragedies and these wars, as you rightly mentioned the other day, that some of them are on the news. Of course, those are most important, but there are many other forgotten ones that are not there. So the task is huge, is unbelievably huge. There were a press briefing a few days ago, last week, by the Under-Secretary Humanitarian Secretary General who was leaving the office. And it's worth it if you go back on the UN site and look at it and see that the number of people in need are in hundreds of millions. And the amount of money that the UN has asked for the government, from the government for the humanitarian needs, I think is about 80 or 88 billion. And so far, they have received only a fraction, about 18 or something. So for me, this is really a task much more important than the time that the UNCC was created. It needs the effort of the international community all together at the level of the United Nations and others. And I hope that will happen, as the questions that was asked before was referring to that. But in the meantime, I was thinking that because it is impossible, this is an impossible task for any government alone or any center, any organization. So one has to work with others, try to do as much as possible, even if these are small steps. The other thing you mentioned, Steve, my work in Bangladesh on the Rana Plaza claims and also on the Tazreen factory, fashion factory claims. There I saw, I mean, we were in Rana Plaza, we were the main, because this was an effort led by international labor organizations and the government of Bangladesh helped with that. But then I saw there were maybe tens of other programs before that they had each addressed one issue. For instance, one group had addressed problems of the pregnant women who were injured in Rana Plaza. They just addressed that part. Or another group had provided food for them. Another group had provided some salaries for them and all that. So these ad hoc, maybe on this situation, which is happening now. I think Professor Moffett mentions that, for instance, that was the government of UK had done. In some areas, they had provided help to others and all that. So these are probably things to be done, and then and of course NGOs can help, and they are willing to help. Again, I saw them very much in Bangladesh, that how much they had helped. The army, I mean, army had helped so much. My image changed from the army. I was talking with the Minister of Labor, who was very nice and was trying to get us a place to start, but it was difficult. So I called the head of the army, whom by chance I had met in a meeting, and without exaggeration, in a matter of minutes, he provided us a place. He said, this is the place you can use if you like, and I am at your service. If you need more help, just come back. So there are lots of people, lots of groups that are going there. Finally, what I wanted to mention, and because I have also read your proposal, I hope that you develop that more. I think a support center, which Dr. Pablo also mentioned in a different context, is very important. For instance, UNCC has lots of experience, lots of documents, lots of programs, softwares, etc., and all that. We made sure and spent lots of time that these are recorded together with lessons learned and all the protocols, all the procedures and everything. And they were sent to New York and they are archived in the United Nations Archive. There was a special bulletin of Secretary General issued on archiving of the UNCC documents. that's very important to get these documents. And there are others. I mean, the ones that I have been involved. Rana Plaza and Tazreen also have lots of documents. We created website and we have kept them. At UNCC, I see that even now is already difficult since a few months ago, because UNCC now is payment is done, it's completely closed. Somehow the website is not there anymore. And I'm receiving calls from a number of people saying, where is, I don't know yet what happened. Maybe we should find out. So if there is a center that has access to these documents and other experience and provide advice, just 1 minute, one sentence to tell you that when I was in Bangladesh, I was said I wanted to start a program. It was a very difficult timing at the middle of the political strikes and all that. I couldn't even leave the hotel, and I was thinking, where do I get a place? Where do I get a staff? Where do I get a claim form? How can I do these things? What are the elements? I mean, if someone, I was lucky, I knew that, so I mainly used my own documents or my colleagues whom I could call and all that. But not everyone is so lucky and have had access to all these documents. So it's good if there is a center that can help them and can provide them, even can provide them some financing. I mean, in the case of Rana Plaza, at the beginning, the German organization for the humanitarian aid, they helped us for some areas of the programs. They provided some, which was very, 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 very helpful. They were present in Bangladesh. So maybe that's what one can do to start, in addition to working with others, pushing the Security Council and talking to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kazazi. I'm going to take the liberty of volunteering a few recommendations of my own, having worked in international relief and development in conflict areas and continuing to be very much involved in it. One of the things that occurs to me is that there's potential for agencies that do provide humanitarian aid to have an educational role about the rights that civilians have. I know that that's a mandate that many international agencies have, but I don't believe the whole issue about compensation or reparations features very centrally for it. So I would recommend that. I'm very interested, Luke, in what you're doing with recording and documentation, but it seems to me that a lot of developments have happened. A lot of agencies now are using what are called client relationship management platforms like Salesforce, whereby data can be stored on behalf of civilians. And I had the idea in some of my work that that data could be, related to the damages that they face, the death certificates, the loss of property values, et cetera, just as a storage point for future claims. One of the other things that's happening a lot now is international agencies are relying on direct cash payments for humanitarian support. There's something called the Grand Alliance, which is 47 different international organizations now that provide cash for humanitarian efforts. And I had wondered whether or not, that's potentially a chain of distribution that could be, used for different agencies doing reparations or compensation programs. The other thing that has occurred to me is there, and maybe is there any definitive annual report about the status of damages that civilians face? And is there a way to get attention from the international community through the formulation of some kind of more annual report? That's something that happens in human rights, for example, and it tends to be the kind of document that people will refer to, particularly in the press and whatnot. And then finally, mirroring what you mentioned, Dr. Kazazi, I think it is vital that we develop a basis of norms and standards about the approaches that are being used, and that they can be shared and understood. And potentially, like you mentioned, could there be a standing body that basically is the go-to entity for supporting this work? I'm very grateful for all the input that we've had, all the presentations that we've had. You've left us with a tremendous amount of information and material to sort through, which we will. I know that, Colin, and I'm, very happy to support however I can, Colin, is contemplating, some kind of notification on the website of the Peace Academy of Wales about this, but I'm looking forward to being face to face with Colin in Wales and deciding, in particular, what are some wins that we can go for on this. So from my side, I'm extremely grateful for all of the input and support that we've had. And Colin, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks everyone for what's been 2 really fascinating webinars. I'm going to abuse my position here and throw in my own 2 pennyworth. And it's not from somebody who knows much about this particular topic area, though I do know now an awful lot more than I did a week or so ago. But it's somebody who worked on the incredibly difficult problem of HIV and AIDS in the early years of this millennium. And to cast our minds back, in the early years of this millennium, 2 million people a year were dying of AIDS-related illnesses. And this was a huge problem. And to use Dr. Kazazi's term, it was an impossible task for any one government. And as people were talking last week and this week, some parallels struck me, because everybody in public health with whom I was working at that time agreed something had to be done, that the current system wasn't working and that people were suffering enormously because the system wasn't working for them. But there was no progress being made at all. So how did we turn it around so that now less than 10% of those in the early years of this millennium are now dying of HIV, and many fewer are becoming infected with HIV? So I think 3 things which maybe have helped to us in thinking about it. Firstly, there was a lot of talk about means and will, that you needed the means and you needed the willingness to do something about it. And increasingly, we began to see this as 2 sides of the same coin. It was about changing the normative bias, away from something being seen as a problem which was too big to get a handle on. And, in some areas of the world, let's be frank, people thought this was a consequence of immoral actions, appalling though that belief may well be to all of us, I hope. How we change that into something where people saw it as a disease which we could, should, and must do something about. And there was a requirement on us as citizens of the planet to try and mobilize our resources to do something about this global problem. So there's a shift in the way in which we saw it. How did we do that? How did we shift that? Well, firstly, we got it on the agenda of the really, really big nation states, for G8 in particular, G9, G8 at that time, G7 as it is now. And we got it through 2 means. Firstly, the sheer weight of evidence. The weight of evidence. And this is what we've heard a lot of tonight and last week, the importance of evidence, the importance of having this huge weight of testimony, of legal argument, etc., etc. That was really important, but it was not sufficient. What was really sufficient was getting the key opinion formers on side. And this ranged from individuals such as Tony Blair in the UK, through to people of huge cultural significance. And do not underestimate the role Bono, lead singer of U2, played in getting HIV and AIDS on the table of the world's political leaders. If you doubt me, go and read George W. Bush's memoirs about this and how important he was in getting George W. Bush to sign off on the biggest health aid package in human history. So it was about weight of argument, but also key opinion formers. And secondly, it was about how you framed it. And we realized very quickly health was not enough. Simply saying HIV was a health crisis was not enough. Saying reparations is required because this is a human rights crisis probably will not be enough. We need to link this into other frames as well. And 2 of those which have been mentioned were development and security. How it's about the security, the future security, about how you sort of build more peaceful societies. If you engage in a process of reparations, this can build societies for the future which are inherently more peaceful. And secondly, the importance of linking this to the development agenda as well, international development. So those are my few random thoughts, perhaps. I don't know how useful they are, but it draws on some experience which I had about 20 years ago, I suppose. all I need to do now is thank everyone. First of all, thank the speakers from tonight and indeed from last week as well. I mean, this has been a fantastic lineup, and I feel privileged to have been involved very peripherally in running this. Secondly, Bethan, who's been fantastic as ever in doing all the technology behind the scenes, making sure that the Zoom actually worked, and that technophobes such as myself were walked through the process so that we understood what we had to do, where and when. Steve, of course, thanks Steve, and I really do look forward to meeting you in Aberystwyth in the next few weeks. And finally, all of you on the call, it's really important that we engage with people across Wales and internationally in these sorts of issues. And I'm really grateful that you spent the time today and last week with us to listen to some fantastic speakers on this vitally important issue. So thank you all, and if you're in Europe, have a great night. If you're elsewhere in the world, have a great afternoon, or indeed, one or two might be morning. Thanks, everyone. Bye then.